All right. Well, it looks pretty good to me. So I'm going to go ahead and welcome folks. So welcome to the February Narrative Medicine Rounds. I am Carl Erik Fisher. And for those of you who are joining for the first time, these rounds are hosted by the Division of Narrative Medicine in the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics at Columbia University. The Division of Narrative Medicine fortifies clinical practice by training practitioners to recognize, interpret, and glean insights relevant to patient care and clinician performance from the study of the humanities, the arts, and creative work, helping all those interested in person-centered, respectful healthcare to deepen their self-awareness, clinical attunement, collaborative skills, and creative capacities through rigorous narrative training and practices. So before we introduce our speaker for tonight, I've been asked to mention a few basic Zoom ground rules. And actually, before I say that, I'd like to say normally that there's captioning at these events. Unfortunately, it's not available tonight. And yeah, the organizers can correct me if I'm wrong. The future videos will have captioning, but unfortunately, that's not going to be live. So a few basic Zoom ground rules. Please keep your microphone muted to cut down on background noise during the program. Be forewarned that if there are any disruptions or inappropriate comments in the chat, you may be removed from the event. We're going to lock the meeting in a few minutes for security reasons. If you leave the meeting or your connection is broken after we lock the meeting, you will not be able to return to the meeting. However, please know that after the event, a day or two later, you're going to get an email with a link to that recording of the event. So you'll be able to watch it in its entirety at that time. In the unlikely event that we have a Zoom intrusion, we will terminate the event right away. Unfortunately, we've done everything we can to make sure there will be no interruptions, but if there is, you'll get a new link in your inbox to a new session as quickly as we can administer one. During the talk, we ask that people to keep the chat interactions to a minimum. And then as we get closer to the Q&A part of the event, we will invite you to submit questions via chat for our speaker. Before then, we won't be monitoring questions, so please save your questions to type into the chat after we make that announcement. This event is being recorded. As mentioned, everyone will get the link a day or two after the event, and you can share it as you wish. Captioning will not be available during tonight's event, like I mentioned, but it will be provided with the recording. And then at the end, we'll have a link to online bookstores to order books or to find more information about our speaker and about the Division of Medical Humanities and Ethics and the program in narrative medicine. So without further ado, I'll jump in and introduce our speaker tonight. And I'll keep it short because I think we'll get into a bit of his biography too. But Patrick Radden Keefe is a staff writer at The New Yorker and the author of the bestseller Say Nothing, a true story of murder and memory in Northern Ireland, which received numerous awards. And more recently, Empire of Pain. Fantastic book. Also received innumerable accolades and well-deserved. His writing has been recognized with the Guggenheim Fellowship, the National Magazine Award, the Orwell Prize for Political Writing, and he's also the creator and host of the 8-part podcast, Winds of Change. Patrick, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you all for being with us.
So we were talking a little bit before the event about the crowd here and about discussing both craft and the content of the book. And I think both are so crucial, especially for this audience who I can only assume are interested in the intersection of medicine with the humanities, and also even just personally how they might explore their own writing itch or think about writing as professionals or writing as researchers. So I was surprised to learn in looking at your history that you were actually quite far along in the sort of preparatory steps, sort of legal career. And it seemed like you were almost on the cusp of taking the bar and plunging into maybe corporate law. I don't know exactly if you even had a job lined up. But it struck me that a lot of the things that you've described loving about your reporting process, like delving into the records and getting sources and getting the information straight, might also apply to a legal career, like some of those benefits you might have felt there. And we're all glad that you're a writer instead. It's a great boon to all of us. But I was just wondering if you could start by telling us why did you write? Why did you feel that itch? How'd you wind up here?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a little bit deceptive to look at my CV because it looks like a transition in the sense that I went to college and then grad school and then came back to go to law school and passed the New York bar actually.
Ah,
And yeah, and looked as though I might practice law. But the truth is that I had always wanted to be a writer. I didn't know quite how to operationalize that. I didn't know many working journalists. I didn't know all that many people who kind of had the life that I aspired to have. And then as now, I mean, this is 20 years ago, but then as now, it's a slightly mysterious career. How do you become a staff writer at the New Yorker? There's no apprenticeship system. There's no kind of in on the ground floor job really. Most of the stories of people doing this kind of thing are serendipitous stories, and so my serendipitous story is that I was risk averse and kind of was good at school and liked school, and so I thought, well, I'll stay in school until I figure it out. And law school kind of combined a series of interests that I had, but I was very aware of the fact that I really didn't want to be a lawyer, and if I were to become a lawyer, gun to my head, I'd probably be a terrible lawyer. So I was sort of from the first moment I arrived at law school, I was trying to figure out other avenues to do what I really wanted to do, and that ended up in my case being I had really tried and failed to get assignments at places like the New Yorker. And so I kind of did it backwards. I got a book deal. I got a deal to write my first book. That was my first real paying writing job. And it was only once I had gotten that book deal and I ended up getting a fellowship in New York and taking a year off of law school and coming in and meeting people that I then started really writing for magazines. And I did end up going back and finishing law school. That first book came out my final year, and at that point, I thought there might be a viable path to writing for a living, and I never really looked back.
I think a lot of people will identify with that. That's my experience in med school, and I've heard from other people in professional schools that they have a yen to write. They have a sense that it might be useful, but they don't know how. So could you just say a bit more about how did you even know how to write a proposal, or what did you do to seek out community or mentorship, or to navigate those early years?
So I did. So I was at law school. I had been sending off pitches to magazines. It was a very different ecosystem back then. There was the New Yorker and the Atlantic and the New York Times Magazine. Um, there wasn't the profusion of outlets that there are today. I mean, it's a strange thing because if you're a younger person today or an older person who wants to start writing, um, the downside is that it'll be very hard to get paid to write. The upside is that there are many, many, many more outlets that are eager for you to write for free, which is not necessarily the worst thing going in. So in my case, I'd been trying and failing to get magazine assignments, um, and there was something I had studied in graduate school at the time. I had done when I went to the UK for graduate school, and I became very interested in what at the time was a quite technical, esoteric subject, which was wiretapping and restrictions on the export of strong cryptography, the National Security Agency, kind of eavesdropping by government agencies. And I wrote a master's thesis about this, and I came back and I went to law school, and my second week of law school, September 11th, happened. And so what had been this kind of niche subject that I knew not a whole lot about, but more than the average civilian, and certainly more than probably the average journalist. Suddenly, I had this tiny little comparative advantage, which was that there was a subject that was suddenly more germane to national debates that I knew a little bit about. And at that point, I felt as though I was never going to break in with magazines and newspapers. And so I thought, well, what if I tried to write a book? And this might actually be a bit of useful practical advice for people. What I did was I looked at the last 10 books that I'd read and enjoyed that were nonfiction books and felt sort of not the same genre per se, but were kind of accessible but serious nonfiction books. And I looked in the acknowledgments where writers tend to thank their agents. And I just made a little list of the agents. And there were two books that I'd read, and I remember what they were. It was Fast Food Nation by Eric Schlosser and The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell. And they both thanked the same agent. And I thought, well, she's got to be good. And I found her email address and sent her an email, just a very short little email, just a few paragraphs. I'm a law student. There's a book that I think could be written about wiretapping by government agencies. I know a bit about this. And she called me. And it's a tricky story to tell because, you know, I was a young white man at Yale Law School. You know, there were a whole series of structural advantages I had. And so even at the time, I felt very lucky. And I think even more so in retrospect, I realized that it doesn't always work that way. You know, she might not have called. There was a fair amount of privilege baked into the fact that having failed to get into magazines, that my kind of initial entry into the book world was really helped by that. But she's been my agent ever since, and I wrote that first book, and that kind of got me started.
Great. Well, thanks. I think that'll be helpful to some folks. But I guess without further ado, let's jump into the work, because I think that's what a lot of folks are here to talk about too. Sticking with craft, though, I was wondering if you could talk about, I thought maybe it would be a nice way in for you to maybe give an overview of the work, to talk about some of the decisions you had to make along the way. I mean, at a first glance, it could be seen as a relatively straightforward crime story of one family that did a certain number of things over time. But it really is beautifully panoramic in the way that it zooms out, zooms in, and then of course the tree ramifies as you go forward. So can you maybe give us an overview of how you got your arms around Empire of Pain?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that it started as an article in the New Yorker, and I was not the first person to write about the Sacklers. I had become very interested in the opioid crisis, and I had gotten there through a kind of circuitous route. I had written a lot about the illegal drug trade, and there was a surge in supply of Mexican heroin starting in around 2010. That people couldn't really explain. We talked about it in the way that we tend to talk about the sort of supply and demand principle when it comes to street drugs in this country, as though the Mexicans just decided suddenly to start fire hosing Mexican heroin onto the streets of the U.S. But of course, it was driven by demand, and the demand was a generation of people who had a kind of an on-ramp in the form of prescription opioids. And at the time, Sam Quinones's book, Dreamland, had come out, a terrific book. Through that, I discovered Barry Meyer's book, Painkiller, which at the time was out of print, but had come out in 2003. The LA Times had been doing good reporting on this subject. But what struck me, I mean, we're talking about narrative here, and there was a narrative choice in a lot of this coverage, which was to, it's funny you use the word panoramic, to tell a story that was truly panoramic. In the sense that you had kind of multiple strands, narrative strands. You had pharmaceutical executives, and you had doctors, and you had people struggling with addiction, and you had law enforcement people and prosecutors. And in this mix, you'd get the Sacklers, this family that owned this pharmaceutical company that had played this kind of, I would argue, catalyst role when it came to the opioid crisis. And sometimes I'm sort of guided in my decision making as a writer by my own impulses as a reader. So when I was reading a book and you'd get 4 or 5 or 6 chapters about something else and then a little chapter about the Sacklers, and then you'd move on to the other stories, my instinct was to want to flip ahead and learn more about that family because I found them so fascinating. And then I learned that none of this had really caught up with them. Like they'd been identified and written about to some extent. But so far as I could tell, when I started looking into this in 2016, they were still pretty revered in high society circles. If you looked, you could find the links between the family and the opioid crisis. But those links weren't following the family around as they moved through the world. It wasn't a question that they were forced to answer. And so initially, to me, the opportunity was I want to write an article in which there's kind of no place to hide. It's not a multi-strand narrative. The aperture is very tightly on the family and questions of their moral culpability and how we should assess it. And so in the first instance, there was this article. It was quite a long article. It ran in the New Yorker in 2017. And then I'm happy to talk about it. But initially, I didn't think there was a book there. And it was over a year later when I thought that there might be a basis for expanding the article into a book.
Mm-hmm. In part because people contacted you, right?
Yeah.
That gave you a wedge into that walled city that the Sacklers had constructed around themselves.
Yeah, that was one of the two big things that changed. One was that the people found me. After that article came out, people read the article. People who had worked at Purdue Pharma, people who had worked for the family, people who knew members of the family socially, and they got in touch with me. And so suddenly there was an opportunity there. And then the other thing was that there was this great tide, this kind of swell of litigation against the company, and then increasingly against individual members of the family. And that was another big wedge because, to mix my metaphors, because it produced a huge volume of private correspondence. So the certainty that the family would not cooperate with a book no longer meant that a book wasn't viable because there would be a way for me to access for instance, their private emails.
Mm-hmm. Now, you start the book with Arthur, which is, I think, in some ways, a huge surprise. I wasn't expecting it going in, but really essential, absolutely crucial to understanding the whole saga. And when I was reading it from a medical perspective, uh, again, to give a sense of an overview of people who are not as familiar with the book, that I felt like I was reading the story of a man who was corrupted by the pull of greed and capitalism toward his own violations of morality and his own overconsumption, in parallel with a corruption of the medical system, when the medical system is organized around profit, that the sort of irresistible pull toward all of these practices that many of the Sacklers pioneered and developed over time. And I'm just wondering, is that just me making up a story, or is that an actual theme that you had in mind when you started off with Arthur?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's funny. Some readers, I think, respond critically to the book and feel that it's a little strange if this is a book about OxyContin that you would devote the first third of it to a guy who died in 1987 before OxyContin was ever introduced. And I sort of resist that. I mean, it was a very conscious choice on my part to devote so much real estate to Arthur, in part because I think he's fascinating. I mean, I think for me, he's far and away the most interesting member of the family. And there is a kind of, I hope that at its best, the book reads like a novel, even though it's true. And Arthur is a character out of a novel. I mean, he feels as though he walked out of a Saul Bellow novel. There's such complexity and such charisma and dynamism that I wanted to try and capture that. But also, I think everything you say is quite right. To me, this was a prehistory that you sort of needed to understand in order to understand everything that came later with OxyContin. And this was true both in terms of the mechanics of the family and in terms of the sort of specific questions of pharmaceutical marketing and the way in which pharmaceutical marketing was used quite specifically to seduce and corrupt in greater or lesser ways doctors. Um, and I would go even further and say that at the broadest level, even beyond marketing, this is a story of the hijacking of medicine by commerce. And I thought that Arthur was interesting because he's kind of an avatar of that very early on.
Yeah, I mean, just a fascinating guy. I couldn't agree more that he is an extraordinary figure, really amazing. On rereading, I just reread the book recently in preparation for this event, and it struck me how he was a communist. He was active in labor organizing,
Yeah.
and I think it speaks to how you're very even-handed, and the book couldn't be further from a polemic. And you let the evidence speak for itself, and you let the misstatements and the untruths speak for themselves. You're not really making a case. You don't read like a prosecutor. But it's extraordinary where he started and then where
So,
he went.
yeah. Yeah, well, and similarly, I mean, he was somebody who, he railed against cigarettes and the danger of addiction and the lies of the tobacco industry. And to see him do that and at the same time make a huge fortune on the marketing of Valium and Librium. And there doesn't seem to be any connection whatsoever. I mean, I read decades of his columns in the Medical Tribune, and interviewed all these people who knew him. And that disconnect doesn't seem to have occurred to him in any way that I could find any record of. But also, even more weirdly, nobody seems to have brought it up to him when he was alive. That it was no secret by the 1970s that Valium was a drug uh, that created big problems for a lot of people who used it. Not everybody, um, but a lot of people. And this is part of what to me is so fascinating about this story, right? Is that like the later generation of Sacklers, he's in the business of making money on something that is, for some people, dangerously habit forming.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I should pause
So
here just quickly to plug Carl's book, which is out much more recently and is an extraordinary book, A History of Addiction, The Urge. Um, but I also feel like A History of Addiction kind of undersells it because it's looking at addiction from a whole variety of different disciplines, and in a kind of deeply rigorous and philosophical way, also bringing in Carl's personal experience and his practice, and unpacks a lot of the types of questions that are sort of lingering just beneath the surface of the book I wrote about, for instance, somebody like Arthur Sackler being able to condemn an addictive substance and the selling and the marketing of an addictive substance on the one hand, and on the other hand, benefit extravagantly from the marketing of another.
I'm honored. I mean, you're too kind. It means the world. Thank you for the plug. Uh, and that's exactly where I was going to go, is the understanding of addiction. Because again, I thought you were very appropriately careful about how far to wade into the morass of addiction in your own book. And it's still, we see in Empire of Pain, the rhyming of history over and over again as people in power deploy notions of addiction in various ways to benefit themselves, or just to protect their own interests. So this notion of physical versus psychological addiction is so crucial. Even in my own book, which is only about the idea of addiction, I didn't get too much into that dichotomy, just one of the many dichotomies that sprung up over time. But I wanted to ask you about that and ask you about addiction narratives and the way we understand addiction, because I could imagine a version of Empire of Pain where we actually go quite deep into empirical or theoretical questions about what are the true causes of the opioid epidemic? What is the relative contribution of the Sacklers versus diseases of despair versus racism and oppression? And the opioid crisis is a bellwether for deeper inequality and all the rest. So you were talking earlier you had to make some conscious choices about how to represent addiction. Could you tell us more about like what were the challenges in writing about addiction per se in a book about the Sacklers?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. There's sort of two answers, and maybe I'll take the earlier one second, which is the kind of question of where do the Sacklers? You look at a public health crisis that has killed over 500,000 people over the course of a quarter of a century. It takes a village, as they say, right? There is no single cause. It's incredibly complex. There's no way any book could do justice to it in all its dimensions, and so there were choices about picking the Sacklers. But it's interesting on the question of addiction specifically. I had made a pretty conscious choice, even when I was doing the article, that there are certain narrative conventions, I think, when writing specifically about the opioid crisis, where, we have a chapter where we meet a small town doctor and he suddenly sees, or a small town pharmacist who suddenly finds that the place has been robbed and there's this new drug that's popular on the street. And then we cut away and we're in suburban Ohio, and we meet the young cheerleader, and she's going out to cheer at the big game, and she falls and has an injury and ends up in the hospital. And then we move on to some other character, and in the weave, we know that we're going to keep revisiting these people in the manner of the movie Traffic or a novel, for that matter. And I think the tricky thing when you have stories of addiction is that from a narrative perspective, there often is a kind of inescapable narrative predictability to those stories, in the sense that it's as soon as you meet the athlete, who's going out for the big game, in the year 2021, you can almost write the rest of the story, right? You know that the injury will put them in the hospital. You know that they will be prescribed an opioid painkiller. You know that they will begin to struggle with it, and there will be a kind of undertow, and they sort of start to lose control. We see with a kind of terrible predictability, we see their lives come apart, and then it becomes this question of like, do they recover? Do they die? Or do they end up in some kind of purgatorial state in between the two? And both in terms of the fact that these stories had been written quite beautifully and movingly by other people, and in terms of my desire to keep the focus pretty tightly on the Sacklers, I made a choice early on not to do that. That there would not be recurring characters where we sort of play out the full narrative of their addiction to OxyContin or other opioids or heroin or what have you. It doesn't mean that there aren't victims in the story or people struggling with addiction. The rule that I gave myself was they have to connect to the Sacklers. There is no cutaway to some random sympathetic character who I've discovered in some other state. There's a theme that runs through the book, which is essentially kind of NIMBYism, right? The idea that there's a certain kind of person who, or NIMBYism is maybe the wrong way of putting this. It's not in my backyard. It's more the idea that I can live a life and benefit from certain decisions which have terrible downstream consequences. But as long as I don't see those downstream consequences in my own beautifully manicured backyard, it's possible for me to kind of sustain the illusion that I'm a good person and that there's nothing all that morally grotesque about the choices that I'm making. And in my own reporting, I knew that this was not true. I knew that, for instance, there was somebody who worked on the property of Mortimer Sackler Jr. in Amagansett who was addicted to OxyContin. I knew that there was a legal secretary who worked on the 9th floor of Purdue Pharma in Stamford, steps away from Richard Sackler's office, who was addicted to OxyContin. Those were the stories that I wanted to try and tell, stories in which there was a kind of a fairly proximate connection to the family.
Mm-hmm. Right, or even people within the family who struggle with addiction and who were treated in a different way or a different narrative, to use that term, was deployed to make sense of their suffering.
Absolutely. I mean, that was, and it was funny. So the what you're referring to is for those of you who haven't read the book, is I had always had a hunch, just statistically, that there must be some Sacklers who had struggled
Right.
with addiction,
Mm-hmm.
and I wanted to find a person who had had that experience. And I ended up learning that there was a Sackler who was one of the sons of the one of the original three brothers, Bobby Sackler, who died in 1975. Um, he killed himself, and he had struggled with addiction. And one of the great paradoxes of this story, I think, is that the Sacklers have a kind of, it's fascinating to see what they put their names on and what they don't. So if you've spent any time in New York City visiting arts or education institutions, you've probably seen the Sackler name because they proudly put it on the wall of places that have received their large S. But it was never on the family company, which I thought was really telling. And when this one Sackler died in these terrible circumstances, his name was essentially erased. There was no plaque. There was no memorial. It was very difficult. It took a lot of reporting for me to even just find out what his story had been.
Well, it's really effective, and I think the the choices certainly make sense to not bite off more than you can chew in regard to an enormous, multifaceted, multi-causal, multi-level phenomenon such as the overdose crisis. Uh, that I do want to mention, because you did mention getting some criticism or some sort of critiques about some of those choices, that I think now, as there's broader awareness of the overdose crisis, there's a strain, especially in addiction advocacy, that says if we focus too much on the Sacklers, or if we focus too much on the power of the drugs, or we focus too much on the notion of the drug as some sort of reductionist agent hijacking people's will and agency, then, at least at the soundbite level, it narrows our focus to what is necessarily a complex and multifaceted phenomenon, and then overlooks the ways that addiction has been used as a weapon, and then overlooks the ways that um, efforts to control and prohibit actually increase harm, so forth and so on. And so when I was writing my own book, I struggle with it. I think, how do you properly represent something that is just complex? It's not so satisfying. You can't tie up in a bow, hey, it's nuanced and there are many causes and conditions going into this. Uh, did you did you worry about that in the writing process? And then how has that been for you since the publication of the book?
Oh boy. I mean, I think it's funny. My last book was a very, very different book about the troubles in Northern Ireland, but similar in the sense that I was parachuting into an extremely vexed and kind of politicized, small p politicized discourse. There was a literature. There were fights that had been going on for decades of one sort or another. Um, and I think that it is I think particularly on that, I, I sort of took on board a lesson at a certain point, and it was one that I carried over into the writing of this book, which is that if you think too much about the way in which people are going to interpret the book or fight over the book or enlist it, or condemn it, particularly if you're thinking about how people will reduce it to a soundbite, I think it would be incredibly inhibiting. Um, on that book, Say Nothing, my previous book, there were moments along the way where I had to stop and kind of tell myself, you are not writing this book for the 20 academics who have been fighting over this subject for 20 years. Um, there would be no point for me in writing that book. And it was somewhat similar here in the sense that I was trying to fill what I perceived to be a hole in the existing literature. Um, the Sacklers were sort of there in the corner, often in these stories, trying very hard not to seem visible or conspicuous, and kind of succeeding, kind of pulling it off. And I wanted to look at them, not purely out of some sense of prosecutorial zeal, but because I thought it was a fascinating story. And I'm interested in the decisions that people make. I'm interested in the way family dynamics operate. And I feel as though it is my maybe selfish prerogative as a writer to write the book that I want to write, to go where my interests take me. To do so, I hope, in a way that is respectful of the existing literature, and where I kind of immerse myself so that specialists who know much more about this than I do regard the book as credible, but not to worry too much about critiques that essentially say, "Oh, we wish that you'd written this book," or "Why did you focus on that?"
Mm-hmm.
And I'll be very candid with you. I mean, the book became a bestseller, right? And it's gotten a lot of reviews. And one of the things that I think is difficult about the position that I just staked out is that, there might be something evasive about me saying, as I do in the book, go and read other books about this. There's no responsibility on me to be the kind of be all and end all book on the opioid crisis. I've taken this part of it that I find really significant and important. This doesn't need to be the only book that people read, but I suppose inescapably it may be the only book that people read. I think one of the things I've had to wrestle with is that sometimes you do the work and you try and do it with as much integrity as you can, and you push it out into the world. And what happens once you've pushed it out into the world, that's beyond your control. The one thing I know with great certainty is that if I thought too much like an advocate of the sort you're describing, if I thought too much about what is the impact that I want this book to have very specifically, in terms of some particular constituency in this story, I would have written a lousy book, honestly. I mean, somebody else can do that and do a great book, but to me, that would be a kind of dilution of the things that I think that I do well and the areas where I feel like I can contribute. So the best I can do is try and produce something that has some integrity. And I do find that to the degree that those critiques are made of the book, they tend to be made by people who don't seem to be engaging with what's actually in the book. What they engage with is the kind of the broad choice. Why focus on the Sacklers? Why not focus on X, Y, and Z? And to those people, I can only say, I think those stories are incredibly important as well, and you should focus on them because I focused on this.
All right. Well, thank you for once again defending yourself against that type of criticism. I'm sure it's getting old at some point. I want to make sure that we have time for questions. So we've got a great crowd. Please drop questions into the chat. We'll take a look and moderate them. We have an easy one to start. Why was the FDA so complicit?
I think a bunch of reasons. I think the most generous interpretation would be to say that the FDA, like a lot of physicians, kind of believed the swan song, the word swan song, the siren song, kind of believed the pitch that this is a story largely about marketing. And if you have people, whether they are public health bureaucrats or practicing physicians, and somebody comes along and says, listen, you got patients in terrible pain, and we have a chemical solution with virtually no side effects. That's a really appealing idea. It's the one to start with and the one to stay with. You can start prescribing it right off the bat. You don't really have to try other alternatives first, and patients can stay on it forever. With nothing to worry about. I mean, that's a very appealing idea, and I think that I think when you squint this looks like a story that's just about greed, but the truth is it's about greed and a healthy dose of idealism as well, but a kind of naive idealism. Um, so that's the generous interpretation. The less generous interpretation would say, there's a story I tell in the book about this fellow Curtis Wright, who was the lead FDA examiner in charge of not just approving OxyContin in terms of its safety and efficacy for sale to U.S. consumers, but also in terms of approving some of the totally off-the-wall marketing claims that were made for the drug. And Curtis Wright, not long after doing so, left the FDA, went to work for Purdue Pharma, and was paid 3 times his government salary. And that, I think, to most people looks a lot like corruption. I haven't really been able to find anybody who would justify that. Like, I reached out to Curtis Wright, and he didn't really offer much in the way of a justification. I reached out to the FDA, and they didn't either. I sued the FDA to get all the emails around the time when he was leaving, and they told me that all of Curtis Wright's emails had been lost or destroyed, which isn't a great look. But I think the important point to make about Curtis Wright, and I would say that this is as true of the FDA today, is that there's corruption. There's corruption of a kind of transparent sort, which is that I slide you an envelope full of cash. That's a bribe, and that's illegal. But what happened with Curtis Wright was not illegal. And honestly, in sympathy with the FDA, I'm not quite sure how you regulate these kinds of situations. Like, what do they say? How much of a cooling off period should there be? 2 years? 3 years? How long do you have to have been gone from the agency before you can go and work in the industry? At a certain point, if you're too draconian, you're not going to get great people or the people you want at the FDA. And so what I worry about is there are many, many people who have been at the FDA since Curtis Wright and who've worked on opioids, who end up leaving, and they, it's not as dramatic a fact pattern, but it's like they set up a consultancy and they have clients, and their clients are the same companies that they were regulating before. The very notion that you're an overeducated MD or PhD working at the FDA, and you've got kids who someday are going to need to go to college, and you got that mortgage, and you're thinking through the next phase in your career. I don't think it takes a lot to plant an idea in somebody's head, and there's nothing illegal about it. And the consequence is a kind of regulatory capture.
Mm-hmm. So we have a lot of great questions. I'll try to triage them and combine as best I can. But an important one that I think is related in the sense of the effects of capitalism on the medical system, not only the regulatory system, but medical practice, comes from Craig Blinderman, a deeply respected palliative care physician who studied under Russell Portnoy, as he points out in the comment. And I won't read the whole thing, but as I understand it, Dr. Blinderman is voicing a concern, which I have had myself, which is that sometimes doctors are portrayed as if they were putty, as if they were just melded or molded by the forces acting on them. And sometimes it's almost as if doctors were doomed to adopt a certain narrative about opioids, about pseudo addiction, about how OxyContin worked, et cetera. And so Dr. Blinderman writes, I worry about the way in which doctors are depicted as easily influenced by capitalist structures. Isn't there another perspective about critical thinking, resistance to capitalism, and medical care not influenced by big pharma? Any thoughts?
Well, I mean, yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. I mean, I think that Russell Portnoy's role in this story is a pretty ignominious one, I would say. I think he's acknowledged as much,
To his credit.
in more recent years. He was not putty. I mean, I think he was sort of part of a system of influence. And I should say, in the case of Portnoy, I don't believe that it was purely money. I think there was I don't think there was a confluence of a conflict of interest in his case so much as a confluence of interest, right? That you have somebody who had a a very zealous, good faith belief in the benefits of wider use of strong opioids, who happened to find an opportunity to turbocharge that point of view in the form of a very willing pharmaceutical industry that found him to be a kind of a useful spokesperson. I don't think it was a situation in which he was out there making claims that he has since said that he made claims he knew not to be true, but I think in the early going, he was quite sincere in saying the things he did. Listen, I think this is the big question, and I guess I would push back a little bit and say that in my book, I suppose you could sort of caricature it and say, oh, look at these doctors, they're portrayed as putty, but part of what the whole book is about is that for Arthur Sackler, for the first generation Sacklers who kind of came of age as physicians in the 1940s and 50s, it was the opposite. The idea was that physicians are incorruptible. Physicians are like priests. They're like rabbis. They cannot be bought. They cannot be influenced. Arthur would say again and again, he would say, oh, they call it medical advertising, but we're not really in the medical advertising business, because how would you influence a physician? All the physician is thinking about is the proper dictates of the right therapy for the patient. That's it. So how do you influence them? So Arthur would say it's education that we're doing here. And I had these conversations throughout the writing of this book where I would talk to certain people, doctor friends of mine, who would say, "Oh, well, I know that the pharma companies spend all this money, and there's this whole it's all kind of distasteful. But of course, that would never change the way I prescribe." And I guess I would push back for the physicians who are with us this evening and say, I think there's a very dangerous vanity in that notion, that you have this huge juggernaut influence campaign, and then a lot of doctors who say, oh, well, that's out there, they're just kind of spinning their wheels, I wouldn't be influenced by that. And the statistic I always think about is that, I've talked to many doctors who said, you could buy me a steak dinner and that's never going to change the way I prescribe. I see through it. I see the whole apparatus. Well, Purdue Pharma spent $9 million a year buying food for doctors. And Richard Sackler would go over the receipts effectively and look at the very specific return on investment for every dollar spent, and when in the week are you spending it, and where are you spending it, and what are we seeing in terms of a very specific uptick in prescribing. And they kept spending that money. So, it may not be... I think it's one of those tricky things where if you have any profession, and I think the same is true for lawyers. I mean, doctors I would hardly single them out, but any profession in which there's some sense of, oh, we answer to a code and we are therefore incorruptible, we would never be putty in the hands of an influence campaign. That to me makes you a very easy mark.
Oh, excuse me. Also an easy mark, politically speaking, because I've been to addiction meetings where there were representatives from the state government who said, it's your fault, to doctors, essentially saying, you have no say in this because you've abdicated that responsibility that you said you had. So I think it's a tricky tension working within a broken system with asymmetric forces acting on us.
Well, and I should say, as far as I'm concerned, physicians could turn around to the state governments and say, actually, you have a lot of blame here as well, right? I mean, there's a lot of blame to go around.
Right. There's one question which I think will wrap up a big question on a lot of people's minds, which is, the short question is, will any of the Sacklers ever do time? But the bigger version of the question is, you had to write this book before the story was done, and the trial's still going, and it's actively being reviewed by the DOJ. And you wrote a very nice profile of Ryan Hampton's book, also a great book, about the settlement. And legally, it's fascinating to me, at least, that the main venue for justice is somehow in this weird civil criminal hybrid where it's kind of about civil law and the utilitarian consideration of dollars and cents, but it's also kind of about justice and culpability and all the rest. So can you give us an update? Like, how has your thinking changed since the book came out? Where do you think things are going? Do you have any predictions or just any reflections on the progress of the legal case? since publication?
Um, well, I mean, my first piece of advice to any aspiring writers out there is try not to write a book on a on an unfolding, you know, litigation nightmare that never ends. Very strange experience trying to figure out what the ending of the book was. Um, the book came out in April, and at that point, I think I sort of had the broad contours of where it was going to go, which is that to answer the first short question with a short answer, none of the Sacklers are going to go to, to prison. I don't think any of them will get criminally charged with anything. Um, in our system, the company that they owned and ran and benefited from can plead guilty to criminal charges, but no individuals were anywhere named as having committed any crimes. So it's this, I say in the book, it's like a driverless car. Our system is designed to kind of secure a guilty plea from a corporate actor, but in some bizarre way in which no human beings are held accountable. You got this resolution in bankruptcy court, the upshot of which is that the Sacklers would be immunized from any future civil litigation. So again, the possibility of criminal charges is still out there, but I think it's pretty unlikely that anyone is going to come forward and bring those. And in exchange, they would pay roughly $4.5 billion to help remediate the crisis. A figure which seems like a lot of money, but when you look at the size of their existing fortune, the fact that they were going to pay out the $4.5 billion over 9 years, and the annualized rate of return on the $11 billion they have right now, they don't have to touch their principal. They can pay this money off over 9 years and be richer when they're done paying than they are when they start. You may have noticed that there was this recent ruling by a federal judge in New York who said that this deal that was made was not a viable deal, that a bankruptcy judge should not be allowed to immunize them in this way. And that seemed like a big reversal for the Sacklers, but I think the truth is we're now seeing that it looks as though there's a mediator working on this, and they'll come up with a compromise, which will probably just be that the family ends up kicking in more money, and then the few states that are objecting will come around. I think there was always going to be a number. And the weird thing from we started talking about me having been at law school. It's strange for me as somebody who's a bit of a, I find this aspect of the law exotic and frustrating, but to have the denouement take place in a bankruptcy court means that everything is transactional, right? That questions like justice and even truth are secondary to the transaction, to the deal. And so there was always going to be a number. And I think the end of this story, whether it was in April when my book came out, or the bankruptcy deal in September, or the reversal, or wherever we're going to end up in a week or two, it's always going to be the same ending, right? Which is that the Sacklers pay a sum of money. The sum of money is large in absolute terms, but compared to the damage done and compared to what they're going to keep, rather small. And they are immunized from any future legal liability relating to the opioid crisis.
Well, Patrick, I hate to leave it there, but that's life. That's where we are. As sort of pessimistic as it sometimes seems, I think there's great beauty and clarity and justice in your book. So
Thank you.
I thank you for writing it and for bringing it to us here. I think I speak for the whole Columbia community. We're honored by having you join us tonight. And I have a little blurb to say. So thanks everyone for joining us. Links to where you can purchase Empire of Pain should now be shared on your screen. A recording of tonight's event will be shared later this week by email to all who registered. And we hope to see you all in March, where we welcome Professor of Reproductive Health, Dr. Carolyn Westhoff, in conversation with journalist Joshua Prager, author of The Family Row. In the meantime, please have a safe and celebratory winter break. Oh, there's my book. Okay.
Yeah. Well, everybody should read it. It's an amazing piece of work. And actually, I think the two books make great companions to one another. So I was really so thrilled you did this, Carl. Thank you.
It was a great pleasure. Thanks so much for coming.